What's up everybody, Marshall Dotson, 6actstructure.com, and welcome to part 2 of my video series on using character actions to easily outline your story. In the first video, we established a definition of an act as the process of a character taking action to achieve a goal, and discovered that there are 6 of these universal character actions, or acts, that fit neatly into the traditional 3 dramatic phases of setup, confrontation, and resolution. In this video, we're going to delve a whole lot deeper by examining the first dramatic phase, the setup, and the 2 acts that compose it, as well as the first 2 stages of the character's evolving goal and the escalating opposition he faces in pursuing it. I'm going to be covering a lot of information in this video, most of which you've probably never heard anywhere else, so you might want to go ahead and grab a pen and pad, or simply pick up a copy of my book, Actions and Goals, The Story Structure Secret, on sale right now. It covers everything in this video series and a whole lot more. And if you're new to the channel, be sure to like, subscribe, and ring the bell to stay up to date with new content. Dramatic Phase 1, the setup. As the name suggests, the first dramatic phase serves the dramatic function of setting up the story. So the first 2 acts will introduce the main character and all of the primary characters. In fact, it's rare to see an important character introduced outside of the first 2 acts, unless the character serves more as a plot device. The setup will also introduce us to the story situation, the opposing sides of the central conflict, and establish the rules of the story world. And at the end of this dramatic phase, the character will be placed on the main through line of the story. Act 1, dealing with an imperfect situation. When the story begins, we find the character stuck in an imperfect situation he is actively dealing with. The imperfect situation is caused by, or is the cause of, the character's initial desire for or against changing his current situation, and the opposition he faces to desiring it. Deep within himself, the character desperately wants something he believes will improve his life. But this initial desire goes against whatever forces govern the world he lives in. For characters who desire to change their situation, they are being pushed into the status quo. In Star Wars, Luke desires to zip off to the Imperial Academy and have adventures, but his uncle needs him to help farm moisture. In Titanic, Rose desires to be free to choose her own path, but her mother needs her to marry Cal so they can keep sipping complimentary mimosas in first class. Conversely, if the character desires not to change his situation, he faces opposition to remaining unchanged. In Iron Man, Tony Stark is content to remain a crap-shooting, womanizing bon vivant, but the people around him insist that he be more responsible.
You are constitutionally incapable of being responsible.
In Good Will Hunting, Will wants to continue running the streets of Boston like a young Mark Wahlberg, but society wants him to use his talents to make a meaningful contribution. The pushback the character faces to his initial desire is part of the pre-existing conflict already occurring when the story begins. In addition to the character's personal problems, we also see that the world he lives in has larger problems of its own. While Luke complains about doing his chores in Star Wars, the Empire is at war with a terrorist organization seeking to disrupt their established peace.
From a certain point of view.
In The Silence of the Lambs, Clarice is worried about trainee exams, while the FBI is already catching heat over their inability to catch Buffalo Bill. All of these pre-existing conflicts combine to make the imperfect situation in Act 1 that much more imperfect. Goal 1, the initial goal. When the story begins, the character already has a goal he is actively pursuing. Even though he's stuck in his imperfect situation, he isn't stagnant. He's an active participant in his own story. The initial goal informs the audience about the character and his situation. When Inception begins, Dom Cobb and Arthur Blank are attempting to extract information from Mr. Saito. This shows us that Dom is good at his job, but also a bit reckless. After the prologue in Finding Nemo, Marlin is actively trying to prevent Nemo from getting eaten by a barracuda or having any friends. We learn how protective he is of his son and how it's affecting Nemo. In Iron Man, Tony Stark simply wants to go about his straightforward goal of making weapons and being awesome. This demonstrates that he is competent, confident, but also kinda irresponsible. The character's initial goal differs from his initial desire in that the goal is something he is actively pursuing, while the desire is only something he wishes he could do. In Moana, the titular little princess desires to sail past the reef, but is forbidden from doing so by her father. Because of this, her initial goal is to come to terms with her place on the island. In Inception, Dom's initial desire is to return home to his kids, but legal problems prevent this from happening. Instead, his initial goal is to extract information from Mr. Saito for COBOL engineering. In some cases though, the character's initial desire and initial goal align. In Iron Man, Tony Stark is living his initial desire of making weapons and being a debaucherous playboy. In Die Hard, John's initial desire is to reconcile with his wife Holly, and he actively pursues this with his initial goal of flying to LA to visit her for Christmas. Opposition 1. Oppressive Opposition. As the character's goal evolves throughout the story, the opposition he faces to it intensifies. When the story begins, the character is facing oppressive opposition to his initial goal. This opposition arises from the fact his initial desire goes against the way his world operates. This may be a literal oppression, like the Capitol in the Hunger Games or the Empire in Star Wars, or a figurative oppression, such as the associates of Tony Stark insisting he be more responsible. Turning Point Catalyst 1, The Disturbance. About halfway into the first act, the character comes to the first turning point catalyst. The turning point catalysts are an event, scene, or a series of scenes that shake up the character's inertia, disrupt the established status quo, and push him toward the act turning point. This event doesn't alter the character's goal in and of itself, but it portends a coming change to the character's life. In Star Wars, Luke stumbles upon Leia's message while cleaning R2 and removes his restraining bolt, allowing the little droid to escape. In Finding Nemo, the disturbance is Nemo's first day of school. In Good Will Hunting, Will gets into a fight with his childhood bully and is arrested when he strikes a cop. Turning Point 1, The Dilemma. Near the end of Act 1, about 15% into the story, the character is faced with a dilemma. Here he is forced to choose between the situation he has always known and entering into a new, unfamiliar situation. This choice is important in that it makes the character an active participant in his story. In many cases, this choice is made obvious to the audience. In The Matrix, this choice is physically represented by the 2 pills Morpheus offers Neo. In Good Will Hunting, Professor Lambeau offers Will a clear choice between going to jail or going to therapy. In some instances, however, the choice is less obvious because it seems to be the only choice to make. But even in these instances, the character is actively making a decision. When Nemo is captured in Finding Nemo, Marlin makes an active decision to go after him. When Dr. Stone is sent spinning through space in gravity, she makes the conscious decision to collect her composure and give Kowalski her coordinates.
ISS is at 7 o'clock.
The new role. Inherent to the character agreeing to enter the unfamiliar situation is a new role he must assume in doing so. The new role is an external representation of the character's arc. If change is the destination he reaches at the end of the story, the new role is the vehicle that gets him there. Will Hunting becomes a therapy patient, and it's only by facing his psychological issues in therapy that he's able to overcome his neurosis and allow himself to be vulnerable. In Die Hard, John McClane becomes a terrorist fighter. In Arrival, Dr. Louise Banks becomes an alien language translator. It is by these characters learning to perform their new roles to the best of their abilities that they are able to overcome the central conflict.
Happy trails, Hans.
So Act 1 can be summarized as: a character in an imperfect situation faces oppressive opposition as he pursues an initial goal. But when there is a disturbance to his routine, he faces a dilemma regarding his situation and must assume a new role. Now let's take a look at how this format can be used to summarize the first act of Iron Man. Billionaire weapons manufacturer Tony Stark is saddled with ceremonies and responsibilities, and is reprimanded by his closest friends and advisors, because he would rather chase skirts and be awesome. But when he flies to Afghanistan to present his new missile to the military and is kidnapped by the terrorist organization the Ten Rings, Tony is forced to either build them a missile or formulate a complex escape plan by building a weaponized suit of armor. Act 2. Learning the rules of an unfamiliar situation. The character's new role takes him into the unfamiliar situation of Act 2. Because the situation is new to him, he must quickly learn the rules that govern it or face harsh consequences. In stories like Alice in Wonderland or the Chronicles of Narnia, the juxtaposition of the regular world to the strange new world is the focal point of the narrative. In the second act of Avatar, Jake leaves the safety of the human camp and goes into the Pandoran wilderness proper for the first time. Here he quickly learns just how different from Earth and dangerous the planet is. In more grounded stories, the character's world doesn't necessarily change, but his station within it does. In Act 2 of Iron Man, pampered billionaire Tony Stark is imprisoned in a cave by terrorists. In Star Wars, the straight-laced Luke Skywalker enters the criminal underbelly of Mos Eisley with Obi-Wan.
Scum and villainy.
In Good Will Hunting, the turbulent Will begins going to therapy. In Titanic, prim and proper Rose becomes friends with a penniless, lice-ridden hobo. The unfamiliar situation is exacerbated by the character's lack of experience in his new role. Though the character has skills that lend themselves to the new role, he must find new ways to use them if he is to succeed in the unfamiliar situation. In Iron Man, Tony Stark has plenty of experience building weapons, but he's never used them to personally fight terrorists. In The Silence of the Lambs, Clarice has been training to be an FBI investigator for years, but she's never actually performed field work or interviewed mass murderers. In The Hunger Games, Katniss is skilled with a bow, but has never trained to kill other people with it. Because the character is thrown into an uncomfortable or dangerous situation in this act, we now begin to get a taste of who he is and what he's truly made of. In Titanic, we learn that underneath the stuffy exterior she's forced to wear, Rose is actually a fun-loving, beer-chugging free spirit. In Avatar, we see that beneath Jake's paralyzed exterior, he is brave and resourceful when he is separated from his team and forced to fend for himself in the Pandoran jungle. Goal 2, the transitional goal. In the second act, the character pursues the transitional goal. As the name suggests, this goal transitions him out of his old situation and leads him into a world he has either purposely chosen to ignore or never knew existed. The transitional goal is often laden with purpose. This is because the goal must be powerful enough to snap him out of his lifelong stasis. In Finding Nemo, Marlin attempts to track down the boat that kidnapped his son. Under normal circumstances, Marlin would never leave the safety of the reef, but this goal is powerful enough to overcome his previous reservations. In Star Wars, Luke goes to Mos Eisley with Obi-Wan in search of a pilot to take them to Alderaan. Though Luke previously balked when Obi-Wan asked him to come with him, when the Empire kills his family, he no longer has any reason to stay on Tatooine. In Arrival, Dr. Banks begins trying to figure out how to communicate with the aliens who mysteriously arrived on Earth, sending humanity into a frenzy. In Inception, Dom and the gang begin puzzling out how to perform a supposedly impossible inception. In The Shape of Water, the generally demure Eliza attempts to get to know the mysterious fishman being held captive at the facility. The purpose of the transitional goal is to bring the character out of the periphery and into the external, pre-existing conflicts of the story. Just as this goal transitions him from inaction to action, it also transitions him from a mere spectator on the sidelines to a true player in the game. Opposition 2, Incidental Opposition. Although the transitional goal has a grand sense of purpose, the character suffers from the delusion that accomplishing it will be easy. However, he soon learns that there are forces in the new world standing between him and his goal. The opposition the character faces to his transitional goal is incidental. The forces of opposition aren't specifically out to thwart the character's goal just yet. Rather, he attempts to accomplish his goal in a manner that places him at odds with the way the new world operates. In Star Wars, Luke is threatened with violence simply for being alive. In Act 2 of Avatar, Jake goes into the Pandoran wilderness with his trusty machine gun and marine training, only to find they aren't nearly as effective as he believes. In Inception, Dom is chased through the streets of Mombasa by the Three Stooges hired by Cobalt to exact revenge for his failed extraction attempt on Mr. Saito. This also demonstrates that, though the nature of the opposition the character faces in this act may be incidental, the force of it is much stronger than the oppressive opposition he faced in Act 1. The increased strength of the opposition clearly establishes the stakes of the new world to the character, and serves as a wake-up call, especially at the Act 2 turning point catalyst, the reality check. The character often enters into the unfamiliar situation with a gross underestimation of what he is facing. But as he nears the end of this act, he receives a healthy dose of reality when his simple plan of action hits a major roadblock and either fails outright or has unintended negative consequences. In Good Will Hunting, Will learns that Sean isn't like the other therapists he's been seeing when his regular provocations lead Sean to choke him out. In Inception, Ariadne follows Dom into his dream and discovers that he's intentionally keeping memories of Maul, who is trying to convince him to stay in limbo. In Avatar, Jake is separated from his team and must fend for himself overnight, fighting off a pack of hungry space wolves. In Gravity, Stone and Kowalski discover the Explorer is catastrophically damaged and their fellow astronauts are catastrophically dead. At the reality check, the character learns that the unfamiliar situation is much more complicated than he assumed. As a result of this realization, the character must next make a resolution to persevere at the Act 2 turning point, the commitment. At the end of the second act, approximately a third of the way into the story, the character makes the decision, or has the decision made for him, to fully commit himself to his new role and take a more active part in the events unfolding around him. He finally begins to understand his place in the new world and realizes the plan he had coming into this act was inadequate. At this point, he goes from being reactive in the first two acts to being proactive moving forward. In The Shape of Water, Elisa makes the decision to break Fishman out of the facility and even attempts to enlist Giles to help. In Iron Man, after escaping the 10 rings and returning to the States, Tony calls an emergency press conference where he announces Stark Enterprises will no longer make weapons. He also resolves to make an improved version of his suit to fight back against terrorists. In The Empire Strikes Back, before he agrees to train Luke, Yoda demands an explicit commitment from his would-be pupil, and Luke agrees. It's also possible, though less common, for the character to have this decision made for him. At the commitment in Get Out, Chris is first hypnotized by Rose's mom, inadvertently undergoing the first phase of the coagula process. The decision the character makes at this turning point puts him onto the main through line of the story. In Arrival, Dr. Banks gets the idea at the commitment to use written language to communicate with the aliens. Her quest to learn the written language of the aliens is what ultimately allows her to acquire the gift they are offering and move independently through time. At the commitment in Inception, Dom learns that the Elder Fisher has died and agrees to take Ariadne along to perform the Inception.
Get us another seat on the plane.
It is only with her help in facing his demons that Dom is able to overcome Mao and perform the Inception on Fisher. In Moana, she convinces Maui to help her restore the heart of Te Fiti if she agrees to help him get his magic hook back. When the two shake on it, they commit themselves to restoring the heart together. So Act 2 can be summed up as, the character learns the rules of an unfamiliar situation and faces incidental opposition in pursuit of a transitional goal. But when he receives a reality check, he makes a commitment to his new role. So we can summarize the second act of Arrival as, Luis travels to Montana to meet the aliens, and bumps heads with other members of the task force and their conflicting methodologies, as she tries to figure out how to communicate with extraterrestrials. But when Luis sees the aliens face to face and can't translate their spoken language, she tries using written words and finally elicits a response. The character's decision to participate in the events of the story at the end of this act gives him a new goal, which takes him into the third act, in the second dramatic phase. In the next video, we'll break down the confrontation phase of the story and the primary story elements of Acts 3 and 4. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe to stay up to date with new posts, and don't forget to pick up your copy of Actions and Goals, The Story Structure Secret, or visit 6actstructure.com for in-depth breakdowns of your favorite novels and films. Thanks for watching.